Hello, dear listener, and welcome to this quiet corner of the evening, where stories unfold like gentle mist across ancient cobblestones, where mysteries whisper rather than shout, and where sleep finds you gradually, peacefully, as naturally as twilight descends upon the Thames. Tonight, we journey together into the gaslit world of Victorian London, to the comfortable rooms at 221 B. Baker Street, where Sherlock Holmes and Dr. Watson sit by a crackling fire as rain begins its soft percussion against the window panes. This story is designed specifically for your restful sleep, a mystery that unfolds slowly, thoughtfully, with no urgency or alarm, only the gradual revelation of secrets hidden within the ancient stones of Westminster Abbey. There is no need to follow every word. Let them wash over you like gentle waves, carrying you toward peaceful slumber. I wonder, dear listener, where you are listening from tonight. Perhaps tucked beneath warm covers as autumn winds whisper outside, or perhaps in a quiet room where the world has finally grown still. Wherever you are, know that this story will accompany you gently into rest, requiring nothing of you except the simple pleasure of listening, of drifting, of letting go. Now, settle in, get comfortable, and breathe with me as we begin. The rain had started shortly after dusk, not the violent downpour that sometimes assaulted London streets with fury and flash, but rather a persistent, whispering rainfall that seemed to speak in hushed tones to the city below, telling secrets to the cobblestones and murmuring gentle reassurances to those fortunate enough to be indoors. Within the sitting room at 221 B. Baker Street, the fire burned with steady warmth, each flame dancing with hypnotic grace, casting amber light that flickered across the familiar furnishings. The Persian slipper containing tobacco, the chemical apparatus on the side table, the violin resting in its accustomed place, and the two armchairs positioned before the hearth where Sherlock Holmes and Dr. John Watson sat in companionable silence. Holmes occupied his chair with that peculiar stillness that Watson had come to recognize as deep contemplation rather than rest. His long fingers steepled beneath his chin, his grey eyes reflecting the firelight as though they held flames of their own. Watson, for his part, had been attempting to read the evening newspaper, but the combination of warmth, rain sounds, and the profound comfort of the familiar room had rendered concentration nearly impossible. The words on the page seemed to blur and drift, becoming merely patterns of ink that held no meaning compared to the simple contentment of the moment. "You are not actually reading, Watson," Holmes observed without moving, his voice soft and tinged with gentle amusement. "You have been on the same paragraph for nearly 10 minutes, and unless it contains the most complex philosophical argument ever committed to newsprint, I suspect your mind has wandered elsewhere." Watson smiled, setting the newspaper aside with no pretense of protest. "You're quite right, Holmes. I confess the rain has made me contemplative. There's something about evenings like this, the fire, the quiet, the sense of the city settling around us, that makes reading seem almost superfluous." "Contentment," Holmes murmured, and there was something in his tone that suggested he was tasting the word, examining it as he might examine a curious artifact. "A state I find both elusive and, when accidentally achieved, surprisingly pleasant." The clock on the mantelpiece ticked with soft precision, each second marked by the gentlest mechanical whisper, a sound so familiar to both men that they heard it only when they specifically listened, and yet Its rhythm underscored every moment spent in these rooms, a reminder that time moved forward with inexorable patience. Outside, the rain continued its gentle percussion, occasionally intensifying just enough to draw attention before subsiding again into that steady, soporific rhythm that seemed designed by nature herself to lull the weary toward rest. Mrs. Hudson had brought tea an hour earlier, and the pot still sat on the small table between them, wrapped in a quilted cosy that kept it warm without keeping it hot, the temperature perfect for a reflective evening. Watson reached forward and poured himself another cup, the liquid flowing with smooth grace, steam rising in delicate spirals that caught the firelight and seemed to glow from within. The china made the softest sound as cup met saucer, a gentle clink that seemed loud only because the room was so profoundly quiet. "More tea, Holmes?" Watson offered, holding the pot poised. "Please," Holmes replied, extending his cup with a languid movement that suggested he was reluctant to disturb the evening's peaceful spell. Watson poured carefully, watching the amber liquid fill the delicate cup, adding precisely the amount of sugar that Holmes preferred, 1 lump, never 2, and stirring it with slow, deliberate motions that created the gentlest chiming as spoon touched porcelain. These small rituals, performed countless times in this very room, had become a form of meditation, actions so familiar that they required no thought, yet provided immense comfort through their very repetition. Holmes accepted the cup with a nod of thanks and sipped slowly, his eyes returning to the fire as though the flames might reveal something of interest, some pattern that only his uniquely configured mind could perceive. Watson knew that expression, recognized it as the look of a man whose brain was never entirely still, even in moments of apparent rest. There was always something turning over in those remarkable grey matter corridors, some problem being examined from new angles, some question being posed to the universe. The fire crackled suddenly, a small ember popping with a sound like a tiny exclamation point in the evening's gentle prose, and a shower of sparks rose briefly before fading into darkness. The wood settled in the grate with a soft sigh, as though the fire itself was relaxing into the evening, accepting its role as provider of warmth and light and comfort. "Do you know," Holmes said quietly, breaking a silence that had stretched for perhaps 5 minutes, "that Westminster Abbey contains more than 3,000 burials within its walls? Poets, scientists, monarchs, soldiers, thinkers whose names shaped the very course of civilization, all resting beneath those ancient stones. I find myself contemplating what secrets such walls might hold, what whispers might echo through corridors where so much history has unfolded." Watson smiled. "Planning an expedition to disturb their rest, Holmes?" "Merely contemplating," Holmes replied, his lips curving slightly. "Though I confess, the Abbey has always fascinated me. Such a concentration of history, architecture, symbolic meaning. It functions as a kind of repository for the nation's collective memory, does it not?" Before Watson could respond, a sound rose from the street below, the distinct clatter of a carriage arriving, hooves striking wet cobblestones, wheels splashing through puddles that had accumulated in the slight depressions of the road. Both men registered the sound, but neither moved, for carriages often passed on Baker Street, and there was no particular reason to assume this one carried anyone seeking their door. But then came the sound of the carriage stopping directly below their window. A pause followed, filled only by rain and the carriage horses' gentle snorting. Then, distinctly, came the sound of the carriage door opening, footsteps descending, and the immediate opening of an umbrella, the soft whoosh of fabric expanding, followed by the altered quality of rain sounds as the droplets struck the umbrella's canopy rather than the pavement. Holmes and Watson exchanged a glance. The peaceful spell of the evening not broken, but certainly altered. Curiosity awakening like a gentle stirring from pleasant drowsiness. Footsteps approached the door below, measured, unhurried, the tread of someone who was wet but not particularly distressed by the condition. A moment of silence suggested the visitor was examining the brass plate that announced Sherlock Holmes's residence and profession. Then came the sound of the bell being pulled, its ring muffled by distance and closed doors, but clearly audible to those who knew to listen. A visitor, Watson observed unnecessarily, setting his teacup down with care. So it would seem, Holmes replied, making no move to rise, but instead listening with focused attention to the sounds below. Mrs. Hudson's door opening, her voice raised in greeting, though the words were indistinct. The visitor's response, also unclear, but with a tonal quality that suggested education and perhaps some urgency carefully contained. Footsteps began ascending the 17 steps to their landing, 2 sets now, Mrs. Hudson's familiar tread and the visitor's, which Holmes appeared to be analysing with that peculiar intensity he brought to even the smallest observations. Male, Holmes murmured, approximately 50 years of age, profession likely clerical, though of high rank, troubled but maintaining composure, came specifically to see us rather than happening by, and carrying something of weight in a leather case. Watson had long since ceased to ask how Holmes extracted such information from mere footsteps, though he felt certain his friend would be pleased to explain in detail if requested. A gentle knock sounded at their door, not the panicked hammering of someone in desperate straits, but a firm, respectful announcement of presence. "Come in," Holmes called, his voice carrying clearly, but without volume that might startle. And the door opened to reveal Mrs. Hudson with a gentleman behind her. The visitor was indeed approximately 50, dressed in the sombre but well-made clothing of someone connected with religious institutions, his grey hair neatly arranged despite the rain, his face carrying that particular quality of thoughtfulness that came from years spent in contemplation and scholarship. He held a dark umbrella in one hand, still dripping slightly onto Mrs. Hudson's floor mat, and in the other carried a leather document case that appeared old and well maintained, its surface showing the patina of long use and careful handling. "Mr. Sherlock Holmes," Mrs. Hudson announced, her voice warm with the affection of long acquaintance. "This is Canon Edmund Whitby from Westminster Abbey. He's asked most politely if you might spare him a few moments, despite the lateness of the hour." "Canon Whitby," Holmes said, rising with fluid grace and extending his hand. "Please, do come in. Mrs. Hudson, might we trouble you for another cup, and perhaps a towel for the Canon's umbrella?" "Of course, Mr. Holmes," Mrs. Hudson replied, taking the dripping umbrella with practiced efficiency. "I'll bring fresh tea directly." Canon Whitby entered the room with obvious relief, and Watson rose to offer him the chair nearest the fire, noting how the man's clothing was damp about the shoulders despite the umbrella's protection, and how his shoes, though of good quality, were thoroughly soaked. "Gentlemen," Whitby said, his voice cultured and carrying that measured cadence common to those who spent considerable time delivering sermons and speeches. "I apologize profusely for this intrusion upon your evening. I debated whether my concerns warranted disturbing you, but after considerable contemplation, I concluded that the matter requires investigation by someone of your unique capabilities, Mr. Holmes." "Please sit," Holmes urged, returning to his own chair and gesturing for Whitby to take the seat Watson had offered. "The evening was pleasant, but uneventful, and your arrival has introduced the possibility of interest, which I confess I welcome. Tell us what troubles you, and take your time. There is no urgency that cannot wait for you to warm yourself by our fire and collect your thoughts." Whitby settled into the chair with visible gratitude, holding his hands toward the fire, as though drawing not just warmth, but courage from the flames. Watson resumed his seat and waited with the patience that years of friendship with Holmes had cultivated, knowing that rushing a troubled client served no purpose and often hindered the full revelation of important details. Mrs. Hudson returned with remarkable speed, bearing a fresh teapot and an additional cup and saucer, along with a plate of biscuits that Watson was certain hadn't been available moments before, but which she seemed to produce as if by magic whenever visitors arrived. She poured for Canon Whitby herself, adding sugar and cream without asking, somehow intuiting his preferences, and waited until he had taken a sip and sighed with appreciation before quietly withdrawing, closing the door with barely a whisper of sound. "Now then," Holmes said gently, once Whitby had taken several sips of tea and some colour had returned to his cheeks. "Tell us of Westminster Abbey and what mysteries trouble its ancient halls." Canon Whitby set his teacup down carefully, and his hands moved to the leather case he had placed at his feet. He opened it with deliberate slowness, the brass clasp making a soft click that seemed loud in the quiet room, and withdrew several items: a leather-bound journal, perhaps 50 years old, judging by its condition, several sheets of modern paper covered in precise handwriting, and what appeared to be a charcoal rubbing of some carved inscription, the words unclear in the firelight, but suggesting Latin, or perhaps older language still. Holmes leaned forward slightly, his grey eyes reflecting interest but no skepticism, his entire demeanour suggesting openness to whatever Whitby might share. "Please describe these phenomena in whatever detail you find relevant. Dr. Watson and I have encountered many situations that appeared supernatural but yielded to rational investigation. Yet we approach each case with minds open to evidence rather than preconception." Whitby nodded, seeming reassured. Outside, the rain intensified slightly, its rhythm against the windows becoming more insistent, though still far from violent. Merely rain that had decided to speak with slightly more volume, still whispering but with greater urgency. "It began," Whitby continued, "with sounds in the poet's corner, footsteps heard by our night watchman, old Thomas Pemberton, who has walked those halls for 20 years and knows every settling stone and creaking board. These footsteps were different," he insisted, "measured, deliberate, following a specific path through the south transept at precisely 2 o'clock each morning. Thomas is not a fanciful man, Mr. Holmes. He served in Her Majesty's army for 12 years before retiring to his position with us. Yet he was genuinely disturbed by these sounds, convinced they represented human movement where no human should be." Watson found himself drawn into the narrative, despite its unsettling elements. Or perhaps because Holmes's presence made even ghostly tales seem merely puzzles awaiting solution. He poured himself more tea, the gentle sound of liquid flowing from pot to cup, providing a comforting counterpoint to Whitby's increasingly strange account. Whitby paused to sip his tea, and Holmes waited with perfect stillness, not prompting or hurrying, simply present and attentive. At 2 o'clock precisely, Whitby resumed. We both heard them. Footsteps, Mr. Holmes. Clear, distinct, following a path that led from Poet's Corner through the south transept toward the Chapel of St. Faith. We investigated immediately, carrying lanterns and searching every possible hiding place. We found nothing, no person, no disturbance, no explanation. Yet we had both heard the footsteps as clearly as I now hear the rain upon your windows. None whatsoever, Whitby confirmed. The exact same route, at the exact same time, with the same measured pace. A few nights later, I returned alone, armed with paper and pencil, determined to map the sound's progression. And again, at 2 o'clock, I heard them, impossibly clear in the profound silence of the Abbey at night. The fire crackled gently, settling deeper into its bed of coals, and Watson rose quietly to add another piece of wood, performing this task with minimal disruption, then returning to his chair as Whitby continued his remarkable account. But the footsteps were merely the beginning, the canon said, his voice dropping even lower, as though afraid the walls themselves might overhear. 3 days after my solo vigil, our verger, a man named Peter Ashford, responsible for the care and preparation of the Abbey for services, discovered something disturbing in the Chapel of St. Faith, which, as you may know, lies in the crypt beneath the main structure. I am familiar with it, Holmes murmured. A Norman chapel, if memory serves, one of the oldest sections of the structure, predating much of the current building. Precisely, Whitby said, seeming pleased by Holmes's knowledge. Peter went down to prepare the chapel for a private service, and found that someone had been there during the night. Candles had been lit, dozens of them, and then extinguished, the wax still soft, suggesting very recent presence. More disturbing, however, was what had been drawn upon the floor. From his collection of papers, Whitby withdrew a sketch, clearly his own work, executed with careful attention to accuracy. It showed a circular pattern, perhaps 6 feet in diameter, containing symbols that Watson did not recognize, but which seemed to carry weight and meaning, arranged with geometric precision around a central point. Holmes took the sketch with evident interest, rising to examine it more closely by the firelight, turning it at various angles, his eyes moving across the symbols with the intensity of a scholar encountering a text in an obscure language that he nevertheless recognized as language rather than random marks. Fascinating, Holmes murmured. These symbols combine elements from several traditions, alchemical, astronomical, and if I'm not mistaken, references to medieval mystical texts that were nominally suppressed by the Church, but which survived in various forms. This central symbol here, he pointed to a mark at the very center of the circle. This appears to reference the concept of liminal space, thresholds between states of being. Whoever created this pattern was remarkably well educated in esoteric traditions. Watson felt a slight chill that had nothing to do with the temperature of the room, for while Holmes spoke with scholarly detachment, the implications of someone performing mysterious rituals in Westminster Abbey's ancient crypt seemed considerably less academic and more genuinely unsettling. Whitby nodded gravely. We cleaned it immediately, of course, and I reported the intrusion to the police, who conducted an investigation but found no signs of forced entry, no evidence of how anyone could have gained access to a locked building during the night hours. The Abbey's security is quite thorough, Mr. Holmes. Multiple locked doors, watchmen on regular rounds, no windows accessible from ground level in that section. Yet someone had entered, conducted some form of ritual, and departed without leaving any trace beyond the candles and the symbols. And after this discovery, Holmes prompted, I presume the phenomena continued? They escalated, Whitby replied, and for the first time, genuine fear flickered across his features. 2 nights after we cleaned the chapel, the symbols reappeared in precisely the same location, though we had posted additional guards specifically to prevent such occurrence. The guards reported nothing, no sounds, no sightings, no disturbances of any kind. Yet in the morning there were the symbols again, exactly as before, accompanied by a scent that our verger described as resembling old incense mixed with something he couldn't identify, but found profoundly unpleasant. Holmes returned to his chair, still holding the sketch, his mind clearly working through possibilities and implications. The rain had settled back into its earlier gentle rhythm, the brief intensification fading, as though the weather itself was content to provide atmospheric accompaniment without demanding excessive attention. Tell me, Holmes said thoughtfully, has anything else unusual occurred in the Abbey recently? Any changes to routine? Any restoration work? Any discoveries made during maintenance? Any unusual visitors or researchers granted special access? Whitby considered the question carefully, his brow furrowing with concentration. Now that you mention it, yes, though I hadn't connected these events until this moment. 6 weeks ago, we granted research access to a scholar from the British Museum, a Dr. Sebastian Aldridge, who had received permission to examine certain medieval manuscripts in our library collection. He spent approximately 2 weeks working in our archives, photographing documents and making extensive notes. A quiet man, very serious about his work, no complaints about his conduct. He finished his research and departed perhaps a month before these strange occurrences began. I see, Holmes said, in a tone that suggested the information had significance he was not yet ready to articulate. And what was the nature of Dr. Aldridge's research? What specific manuscripts or documents was he examining? He was studying records from the Abbey's construction and early history, Whitby replied, particularly documents relating to the original Saxon church that occupied this site before the current structure. He seemed especially interested in accounts of various items that were supposedly sealed within the foundations when the Norman church was built. Relics, manuscripts, objects of religious significance that were preserved in the walls and floors according to medieval custom. Watson saw Holmes's eyes sharpen with interest, though his voice remained calm and measured when he spoke. And these objects, do records indicate what they were, specifically? Various items, Whitby said, consulting his notes. The records are fragmentary and often written in Latin that requires translation. But Dr. Aldridge compiled a list of possibilities based on multiple sources. Among the items mentioned were fragments of texts supposedly dating to Britain's Christian conversion period, objects claimed to have protective or spiritual properties, and He hesitated. This sounds absurd when spoken aloud, but the records mention something called the threshold stone, a piece of carved stone supposedly brought from Jerusalem during the Crusades, inscribed with prayers meant to facilitate communion between earthly and divine realms. The fire popped softly, a small sound that nevertheless made Watson start slightly, the combination of Whitby's narrative and the late hour beginning to work upon his imagination despite his rationalist inclinations. Holmes, however, seemed energized rather than unnerved by these revelations, his posture suggesting focused attention rather than concern. "And Dr. Aldrich, you say he departed a month ago. Have you had any contact with him since? Any indication of what conclusions he drew from his research?" "None," Whitby replied. "He thanked us for our cooperation, indicated he had found the materials most illuminating, and departed. I could provide you with his contact information at the British Museum, if that would be helpful." "Very helpful indeed," Holmes confirmed. "Now, Canon Whitby, you mentioned you brought several items with you: the journal, the papers, the rubbing. Please tell me about each." Whitby carefully lifted the leather journal, handling it with obvious reverence for old objects. This belonged to Canon Henry Blackwood, who served at the Abbey from 1810 until his death in 1848. It was discovered 3 weeks ago during cataloguing of our historical documents. Apparently, it had been misfiled, placed among account books rather than personal papers. I began reading it out of historical curiosity and found several entries that seem... He paused, searching for the right word. Relevant. He opened the journal to a page marked with a ribbon and read aloud, his voice taking on the slight formality one uses when reading another's words. "September 14th, 1847. I have experienced again the peculiar sensation I first noted a fortnight past. At night, when the Abbey lies quiet and I work late in my study, I hear distinctly what sounds as footsteps passing through the south transept, always at the same hour, 2 o'clock, that peculiar time which folklore names as belonging neither to day nor night. I have investigated repeatedly and found nothing, yet the sounds continue with such regularity that I can only conclude they represent some phenomenon beyond my current understanding. More troubling still, I have discovered marks in the chapel of St. Faith, symbols whose meaning I cannot ascertain, but which fill me with inexplicable unease." Watson felt the small hairs on his arms rise, for the parallels between Blackwood's 19th century account and Whitby's current experiences were too precise to dismiss as coincidence. Whitby continued reading. "I have consulted such historical documents as are available to me, searching for previous accounts of unusual phenomena, and have found fragmentary references suggesting that these occurrences may be cyclical, appearing at intervals that I have not yet determined, but which may relate to astronomical or calendrical patterns. The Abbey's foundations contain many secrets, placed there by builders who understood dimensions of reality that our modern age has perhaps forgotten or dismissed. I fear I am glimpsing something that was meant to remain hidden, and yet I cannot turn away from this mystery." The canon closed the journal gently. That is the last entry in which Blackwood mentions these phenomena. Subsequent entries return to mundane matters: services, visitors, administrative concerns. He died the following year, and there is no indication that he ever solved his mystery or even continued investigating it. Holmes sat very still, his hands steepled before his face, his eyes distant with thought. When he finally spoke, his voice carried that quality of careful reasoning that Watson had heard countless times when his friend began assembling disparate facts into coherent theory. "What we have," Holmes said slowly, "is a pattern of phenomena that appears to be recurring across significant time intervals. Canon Blackwood experienced these events in 1847, some 75 years ago. You are experiencing what appear to be identical phenomena now, in 1922. This suggests not random haunting, if we accept such terminology temporarily, but rather something with specific periodicity. But what could cause such a thing?" Watson asked, finding his voice drawn into the discussion, despite his intention to merely observe. What natural explanation could account for footsteps and symbols appearing across decades? "Several possibilities present themselves," Holmes replied, his tone thoughtful rather than certain. "The footsteps, for instance, might indeed be acoustic phenomena, sounds created by thermal expansion and contraction of the building structure, following patterns established by the building's architecture and recurring under specific conditions of temperature and humidity that appear seasonally or in longer cycles. As for the symbols," he paused, examining Whitby's sketch again, "those require human agency. Someone is drawing them, which means either living persons with access to the Abbey or—" He smiled slightly. "Well, let us exhaust natural explanations before entertaining more exotic possibilities." A church bell tolled in the distance, its sound muffled by rain and distance, marking the hour. 10 o'clock, Watson noted, which meant they had been conversing for nearly an hour, though it seemed like far less time, the narrative holding his attention despite the late hour. "Canon Whitby," Holmes said, setting down the sketch and regarding their visitor with focused attention, "I am very interested in this case, and with your permission, I would like to visit Westminster Abbey to conduct my own investigation. I would need access during nighttime hours, freedom to examine the chapel of St. Faith and any relevant historical documents, and your discretion regarding my presence. The fewer people who know of my investigation, the better." Whitby's relief was palpable. "Mr. Holmes, you have my complete cooperation, and the Abbey is yours to investigate as you see fit. I can provide you with keys and ensure that our night watchmen are informed of your presence so as not to interfere. When would you like to begin?" "Tomorrow night," Holmes said without hesitation. "That will give me time today to research Dr. Aldridge, to examine what records might exist at the British Museum regarding medieval mystical practices, and to prepare whatever equipment might prove useful. I suggest that you maintain normal routines at the Abbey, make no special preparations, alert no one beyond the essential staff who must know of our presence. If someone is indeed orchestrating these events through trickery, I do not wish to advertise that they are under investigation. And if it proves to be something other than trickery?" Whitby asked quietly, and in his voice was genuine uncertainty, the faith-based worldview of a religious scholar encountering phenomena that seemed to validate supernatural frameworks he had perhaps approached more as metaphor than literal reality. Holmes's expression softened with something approaching sympathy. "Canon, in my experience, the universe operates according to principles that can be understood through observation and reasoning. I have encountered many phenomena that appeared supernatural, but yielded to rational explanation. However, I approach each case with an open mind, willing to revise my assumptions when presented with sufficient evidence. If Westminster Abbey harbours something truly beyond conventional explanation, we shall discover it and deal with it appropriately. But I suspect we shall find human agency behind these mysteries, motivated by purposes we have yet to understand. Whitby nodded slowly, seeming reassured by Holmes's balanced approach. He gathered his documents carefully, replacing them in the leather case, then stood with the slightly stiff movements of someone who had been sitting in damp clothes and was now paying the price in protesting joints. "I cannot thank you enough, Mr. Holmes," he said earnestly. "This matter has weighed heavily upon me, disrupting my sleep and filling my thoughts with troubling questions. Simply knowing that you will investigate brings tremendous relief." Holmes rose as well, extending his hand. "We shall get to the bottom of this, I assure you. Mysteries may appear impenetrable initially, but they all possess logic, patterns, explicable causes. Your threshold stone and recurring phenomena will prove no exception." Watson saw their visitor to the door, helping him into his still damp coat, returning his umbrella from where it had been drying by the fire, and watching as he descended the stairs with Mrs. Hudson appearing as if summoned, which, knowing her remarkable intuition, she perhaps had been, to see him out into the rain-soaked night. When Watson returned to the sitting room, he found Holmes standing before the fireplace, staring into the flames with an expression of deep concentration, the sketch of the mysterious symbols still held in one hand, his mind clearly already far away, walking the darkened corridors of Westminster Abbey in imagination, assembling facts and observations into preliminary theories. "You're intrigued," Watson observed, resuming his seat and pouring the last of the tea, which had cooled to a pleasant warmth, no longer hot but still comforting. "Intensely," Holmes admitted, turning from the fire with eyes that gleamed with intellectual excitement. "This case presents several fascinating elements, Watson. The historical precedent established by Canon Blackwood's journal, the involvement of a researcher investigating sealed medieval artifacts, the precision and repetition of the phenomena. All of these suggest careful planning rather than random occurrence. You believe someone is deliberately creating these mysteries?" Watson asked. "To what purpose?" Outside, the rain had settled into a steady, gentle rhythm that seemed likely to continue through the night, neither increasing nor decreasing, simply present as a constant soft percussion against the windows, against the roof, against the streets of London, washing everything clean in the darkness. Watson stifled a yawn, the lateness of the hour and the warmth of the fire combining to make concentration difficult despite his interest in the case. Holmes noticed, of course, missing nothing, and smiled with genuine affection. "To bed with you, Watson," he said gently. "We shall need our rest for tomorrow night's investigations. Westminster Abbey in darkness is no place to enter with a tired mind." "And you?" Watson asked, knowing the answer, but asking nonetheless. "I shall sit up a while longer," Holmes replied, his gaze returning to the sketch. "These symbols trouble me. They represent genuine scholarship, not the random inventions of someone playing at mysticism. I wish to commit them to memory and consider what they might reveal about our mysterious ritualist's intentions." Watson rose, the pleasant fatigue of a quiet evening settling into his bones, making each movement slow and deliberate. "Good night then, Holmes. Try not to stay up until dawn." "Good night, my dear fellow," Holmes murmured, already absorbed once more in his contemplation. Watson climbed the stairs to his room, hearing behind him the soft sounds of Holmes moving about the sitting room, the rustle of papers, the quiet scratch of pencil on notebook as observations were recorded, the settling of the fire as it burned lower, and underneath it all, the endless gentle whisper of rain, London's lullaby, the sound of a city sleeping while mysteries waited in ancient shadows for those brave or foolish enough to seek them out. Morning arrived with that particular quality of light that follows substantial rain. Everything washed clean, colours appearing more vivid, the air itself seeming fresher, as though the night's precipitation had rinsed away accumulated dust and grime, both physical and metaphysical. Watson descended to the sitting room shortly after 8 o'clock to find Holmes already dressed and examining a collection of books that had apparently been delivered early, piled on the table amidst the breakfast things that Mrs. Hudson had laid out with her characteristic efficiency. "Good morning, Watson," Holmes greeted him cheerfully, looking not at all like someone who had likely slept little, if at all. "I've sent to the British Museum for several volumes on medieval mysticism and architectural symbolism. Young Billy brought them round at 7, bless him. I shall have to tip him generously for venturing out so early." Watson poured himself coffee, the rich aroma clearing the last cobwebs of sleep from his mind, and examined the breakfast offerings, kippers, eggs, toast, marmalade, all still warm beneath silver covers. "Have you slept at all?" he asked, though the answer seemed evident. "A few hours," Holmes replied vaguely, his attention primarily on a large volume opened before him, its pages covered in intricate diagrams and text in what appeared to be medieval Latin. "Watson, look at this. It's a 13th century manuscript discussing the consecration of churches and the practice of sealing sacred objects within foundations." Apparently, this was quite common during major construction projects. Builders would place relics, blessed items, even copies of important texts within the walls and beneath floors, believing these would sanctify the structure and provide spiritual protection. Watson approached, carrying his coffee, and looked over Holmes's shoulder at the yellowed pages, with their elaborate illustrations, showing churches in cross-section, small symbols indicating where various items had been placed within the architecture. The drawings possessed that peculiar combination of precision and stylization, characteristic of medieval illumination, part technical diagram and part devotional art. So, Canon Whitby's mention of objects sealed in Westminster Abbey's foundations would have been standard practice, Watson asked. "Precisely," Holmes confirmed, which means that Dr. Aldridge's research into such sealed items was examining historical fact rather than legend. The question becomes, what exactly did he discover, and has that discovery motivated someone to begin searching for these objects? Holmes turned several pages, pointing to a passage he had evidently marked earlier. This text discusses something called liminal objects, items that were believed to exist partially in the physical realm and partially in the spiritual, serving as connections between mortal and divine spheres. The threshold stone that Canon Whitby mentioned would fit this category. If medieval records indicated such an object was sealed within Westminster Abbey, someone with certain obsessions or beliefs might go to considerable lengths to locate it. But surely, Watson objected, attempting to excavate Westminster Abbey in search of a 700-year-old stone would be impossible without being immediately noticed. The building is never truly empty, and any significant digging would cause obvious damage. Unless, Holmes said thoughtfully, one knew precisely where to look. If Dr. Aldridge's research provided specific information about the location of sealed objects, the search might be conducted with surgical precision, affecting only a small area that could be concealed or explained away as routine maintenance. Moreover, if these nighttime rituals are not merely theatrical misdirection, but actual attempts at divination or supernatural detection, our perpetrator might be attempting to locate the objects through mystical means before undertaking physical excavation. Watson sat down with his breakfast, considering this scenario while addressing his kippers with the attention that excellent cooking deserved. The theory had logical coherence, assuming one granted the possibility that someone genuinely believed medieval mystical practices could locate hidden objects. Not an unreasonable assumption, given that London contained numerous individuals who practiced various forms of spiritualism, theosophy, and esoteric ritual. Some as calculated frauds, but others as true believers. So, your theory, Watson said between bites, is that, Doctor? Aldridge discovered specific information about sealed objects, possibly including this threshold stone, and either he himself or someone he shared his findings with is now attempting to locate these items through a combination of historical research and mystical ritual. It is one possibility among several, Holmes replied, closing the medieval volume and opening another, this one more recent, a Victorian text on secret societies and mystical orders. I am also considering the possibility of multiple actors with different agendas. Dr. Aldridge conducting legitimate historical research, unaware that someone else, perhaps someone with access to his work or his notes, is pursuing a more obsessive agenda, or perhaps a secret society that has maintained interest in these objects across generations, waiting for sufficient historical information to make a search feasible. The clock chimed 8:30, its sound clear and bright in the morning air, and Holmes suddenly stood, a decision clearly made. I shall visit the British Museum this morning, he announced, to speak with Dr. Aldridge if he is available, or at minimum to investigate his background and recent research. Watson, would you be willing to visit Westminster Abbey in daylight? I'd like someone to examine the Chapel of St. Faith, to look for any physical evidence of excavation or searching, any disturbances that might indicate someone is conducting methodical investigation of the structure. Canon Whitby can provide you access. Watson nodded, the prospect of contributing actively to the investigation appealing to him. I'd be happy to. What specifically should I look for? Holmes moved to the desk and quickly sketched a few notes. Any signs of recent disturbance to flooring or walls, particularly in areas that might correlate with the symbols from Whitby's sketch. Look for marks indicating measurement, small scratches or chalk marks that might suggest someone is methodically mapping the space. Examine the candle wax if any remains. Its quality might indicate whether it's common material or something more specialized. And observe the general layout, the acoustics, anything that might explain those mysterious footsteps through natural rather than supernatural means. Watson accepted the notes, finishing his breakfast with renewed purpose. The morning had transformed from quiet routine to purposeful investigation, the case providing structure and direction to the day. They departed Baker Street together shortly after 9, the streets still showing evidence of last night's rain in puddles reflecting grey sky, though the precipitation itself had ceased. The air held that scrubbed clean quality that made breathing a pleasure, and despite the overcast conditions, there was a sense of vitality to the city that morning. People moving with the purposeful energy of a new day. Holmes hailed a hansom cab, and they rode together as far as Trafalgar Square, where their routes diverged, Holmes continuing to the British Museum, while Watson proceeded toward Westminster. Through the cab window, Watson watched London passing, familiar streets and buildings, the endless variety of humanity going about daily business, the magnificent chaos of Empire's capital city conducting its eternal commerce and conversation. The journey to Westminster Abbey took perhaps 20 minutes through morning traffic. Carriages, carts, the occasional motor vehicle adding its mechanical rattle to the symphony of horses and wheels and voices. When the cab deposited him before the Abbey's western entrance, Watson stood for a moment, simply looking up at the Gothic magnificence, the towers rising toward grey sky with a grace that seemed impossible given their weight and antiquity. He had been here many times, of course, for Westminster Abbey existed as one of those permanent fixtures in the London consciousness. Always present, always significant, a building so embedded in national identity that one could easily forget to actually see it, to appreciate the remarkable achievement it represented. But this morning, with Canon Whitby's mysterious narrative fresh in his mind, Watson looked at the ancient stone with new attention, imagining the countless feet that had crossed these thresholds, the ceremonies and coronations and burials, the accumulated weight of history pressing down upon the very ground. A side door opened. Watson had sent word of his coming, and Canon Whitby appeared, looking considerably better than he had the previous night, the relief of having shared his burden evidently providing restorative effect. "Dr. Watson," he greeted warmly, extending his hand. "Thank you for coming. Mr. Holmes has begun his investigation already." "He's pursuing other lines of inquiry this morning," Watson explained as they shook hands. "He's asked me to examine the chapel of St. Faith, to look for any physical evidence that might shed light on these mysteries." "Of course," Whitby said, ushering him inside. "I'll take you down directly. The chapel is not open to general visitors, and we've maintained privacy regarding the unusual occurrences, so we shouldn't be disturbed." They entered through a small side door, and Watson immediately felt the profound shift in atmosphere that always accompanied transition from London's bustling streets to Westminster Abbey's interior. The air itself seemed different, cooler, stiller, weighted with centuries of prayer and ritual, of generations who had sought and celebrated and mourned within these walls. Sound behaved differently here, footsteps echoing in complex ways, the acoustics transforming normal human movement into something more significant, more resonant. Whitby led him through passages that Watson had never seen, routes used by clergy and staff rather than tourists and worshippers, corridors of ancient stone lit by electric bulbs that seemed anachronistic against medieval architecture. They descended a staircase, the stone steps worn smooth by countless feet, the walls pressing close on either side, and emerged into the crypt level where Norman architecture predated the Gothic splendour above. The chapel of St. Faith occupied a vaulted space that would have been dark as pitch without the electric lighting that had been installed, presumably in recent decades. The ceiling curved overhead in classic Romanesque arches, the stone unadorned by the elaborate carvings that characterized later medieval work, relying instead on the honest beauty of proportion and solid construction. An altar stood at one end, simple and dignified, and the floor was ancient flagstone, each piece worn smooth by time. "Here," Whitby said quietly, his voice automatically lowering in the chapel space. "This is where we found the symbols, drawn in what appeared to be chalk, arranged around this central point." He indicated a spot near the chapel's centre, roughly equidistant from the surrounding walls. Watson knelt carefully, examining the floor with attention to detail that years of medical observation and Holmes's influence had cultivated. The flagstones showed their great age, surfaces smooth but not perfectly flat, edges slightly irregular where centuries of settling had shifted them minutely. He could see no obvious trace of the chalk symbols, but careful examination revealed faint marks, residue that had worked into the microscopic irregularities of the stone, not visible from standing height, but perceptible when one looked closely with proper lighting angle. The chalk they used was high quality, Watson observed, running his finger gently across the faint marks. Not common blackboard chalk, but something finer grained, probably intended for technical drawing or artistic work. It's taken considerable scrubbing to remove this much. There would have been significant residue after the first cleaning. Indeed, Whitby confirmed. Our verger spent considerable time removing the marks, and yet they reappeared the following night, suggesting whoever is doing this has substantial supply of similar material. Watson produced the sketch Holmes had made of the symbols, comparing it to the faint marks he could still perceive. The pattern matched precisely, a circle perhaps 6 feet in diameter, containing geometric shapes and symbols, all arranged with clear intention around a central point. Rising, Watson paced the boundaries of the circle, noting how it had been positioned. Canon, this placement is deliberate relative to the chapel's architecture. The circle's centre aligns with a point equidistant from these 3 pillars. Someone has measured carefully. He looked up at the vaulted ceiling, at the walls, examining the space with growing comprehension. This room's proportions, they follow classical sacred geometry, don't they? The ratios between length and width, the height of the vaults, these would have been calculated according to medieval architectural theory to create specific acoustic and spiritual properties. Whitby nodded, clearly impressed. "You have an educated eye, Doctor." "Yes, Norman churches particularly followed strict geometric principles, believed to encode divine proportion and meaning into physical space. This chapel would have been constructed using measurements based on those principles." Watson continued his examination, walking the chapel's perimeter, running his hands along the walls, occasionally kneeling to examine the floor more closely. Near the altar, he found what he was seeking: small marks scratched into the mortar between stones, barely visible but clearly deliberate. Measurement marks, made recently, the stone dust from the scratching still faintly visible in the crevices. "Someone has been measuring the walls," Watson announced, gesturing for Whitby to look. Here and here, small reference marks, made with something metal and sharp. They're mapping the space, possibly looking for irregularities that might indicate sealed cavities or hidden chambers. Whitby knelt beside him, examining the marks with growing alarm. "These were not here before last month. I would have noticed. Someone is systematically studying the chapel's construction." Watson pulled out his notebook and began sketching the chapel's layout, noting the location of the measurement marks, the position of the symbol circle, the altar's placement, the positions of the 3 supporting pillars. Holmes would want detailed documentation, and Watson took pride in being thorough, in capturing information that might prove significant, even if its importance wasn't immediately apparent. The silence of the chapel began to work on Watson's awareness, that profound quiet of deep underground spaces removed from the world's noise. He could hear his own breathing, the soft scratch of pencil on paper, the almost imperceptible sound of Whitby standing patiently nearby. And underneath all of that, or perhaps imagined, a sense of presence, of the accumulated years pressed into these stones, of all the prayers and rituals that had been performed here when this chapel was new, and the world above was dramatically different from the London Watson knew. A sound made both men freeze, the distinct creak of a door opening, followed by footsteps on the stone stairs they had descended. Watson and Whitby exchanged glances, the canon clearly surprised, as these areas were not open to the public, and few had reason to visit the crypt level during normal hours. The footsteps descended with unhurried confidence, neither stealthy nor hurried, the tread of someone who had every right to be present. A moment later, a figure appeared in the chapel entrance, a man of perhaps 40, tall and spare, with dark hair beginning to grey at the temples, dressed in the practical clothing of someone who spent time in dusty archives and ancient buildings. "Canon Whitby," the man said, with mild surprise. "I didn't expect to find anyone here at this hour." "Mr. Pemberton," Whitby replied, and Watson detected relief in his tone, the canon clearly recognizing the new arrival as someone expected and appropriate. "I was showing Dr. Watson the chapel. Dr. Watson, this is Thomas Pemberton, our night watchman, the gentleman I mentioned last night, who first heard the mysterious footsteps." Pemberton nodded respectfully to Watson, his weathered face showing the pleasant creases of a man who smiled regularly, but also the deeper lines of someone who had seen difficult things. His eyes held alertness, the sharp awareness of someone trained to notice details and anomalies. "Dr. Watson," Pemberton said, "I understand you're assisting Mr. Sherlock Holmes with investigating our peculiar situation." "Indeed," Watson confirmed. "I'm examining the chapel for any physical evidence that might explain recent events. Canon Whitby has shared your account of the footsteps. As someone with military experience, your observations carry considerable weight." Pemberton acknowledged this with a slight nod that suggested appreciation for having his judgment respected. "I know what I heard, Doctor. Spent 12 years in Her Majesty's service, much of it in places where awareness of one's surroundings meant the difference between living and dying. I'm not given to imaginings or fancies. The footsteps I heard were real, following a specific path, occurring at a specific time. Whether they're made by living persons through some means I haven't determined, or by something else." He paused. "Well, that's beyond my ability to judge. Would you be willing to show me the path these footsteps follow?" Watson asked. "From their starting point in Poets' Corner through to this chapel." "Gladly," Pemberton agreed, "though we'll be retracing them in reverse, as the sounds appear to move toward this location rather than away from it." The three men ascended from the crypt, emerging into the Abbey's main level, where grey daylight filtered through the magnificent stained glass windows, creating pools of coloured illumination that shifted slowly as clouds moved across the sky beyond. The space felt vast after the intimate confines of the crypt, soaring Gothic architecture drawing the eye and the imagination upward. The intricate fan vaulting of the ceiling seeming to float impossibly far overhead. Pemberton led them to Poets' Corner, where memorials to England's literary giants crowded the walls and floors. Shakespeare, Chaucer, Dickens, and dozens more, their names and achievements carved in stone, their actual remains sometimes present, but often merely commemorated. The corner functioning as both cemetery and monument to the power of words. "The sounds begin here," Pemberton said, positioning himself near Chaucer's memorial. "At precisely 2 o'clock, I hear what sounds like someone starting to walk from this spot. The footsteps are measured, neither hurried nor slow, and they follow this path." He began walking, and Watson and Whitby followed. Moving through the south transept, past these monuments, along this corridor. His voice echoed softly as they walked, their actual footsteps creating entirely different acoustic patterns than he was describing, and eventually descending to the crypt level and entering the chapel of St. Faith, where they cease. Watson observed carefully, noting the path's characteristics. It wound through the Abbey in a way that seemed deliberate rather than random, following a route that, he suddenly realized, would have existed in medieval times, before later additions and renovations complicated the building's layout. Someone familiar with the Abbey's architectural history could have planned this path to represent a route that dated to the structure's earliest construction. "Mr. Pemberton?" Watson asked as they completed the route, standing once more outside the crypt entrance. "In your rounds, have you noticed anything else unusual? Any signs that someone has been accessing the building during your night watch?" Pemberton considered carefully before responding, his face showing the concentration of someone reviewing mental records of observation. "Nothing definitive," he said slowly, "but I have occasionally felt that objects were not quite as I left them. Small things. A door that I'm certain I locked being unlocked, though there are numerous keys and various people have access. Chairs in the library repositioned slightly. Once I found mud on the floor near the crypt entrance, though it hadn't rained for days, and everyone who works here regularly is careful about cleanliness out of respect for the building." "The mud," Watson said quickly. "What kind? Clay or dirt or something else?" "Clay, I think," Pemberton replied. "Yellowish, not the typical dark soil from London. It made me wonder where it came from, but I simply cleaned it up and thought no more about it at the time." Watson made a note. Holmes would find that detail significant. London had various soil types in different areas, and clay of particular colour might indicate the intruder's origin point, or somewhere they had been before entering the Abbey. Canon Whitby checked his watch, a gesture that reminded Watson of time's passage, the morning advancing while he had been absorbed in investigation. "Gentlemen, I must prepare for a service shortly. Doctor." "Watson, you're welcome to continue examining anything you find relevant. Mr. Pemberton can provide access to any areas you wish to see." "Thank you, Canon," Watson replied. "I think I've gathered sufficient information for now. Mr. Holmes will want to conduct his own examination tonight, and I'll ensure he's aware of everything I've observed." They returned to the chapel of St. Faith briefly, so Watson could complete his sketches, adding architectural details he had missed initially, noting the relative positions of various elements. Pemberton waited patiently, occasionally offering observations about the space, or answering Watson's questions about routine maintenance and access. "One more question," Watson said as he finished his notes. The candles that were found after the ritual. Do you know what happened to them? Kept as evidence, Pemberton replied. They're stored in the verger's office. I can show you if you'd like. They ascended once more and made their way through staff corridors to a small, tidy office where Peter Ashford, the verger, maintained supplies and records. Pemberton retrieved a box from a cabinet, and inside were perhaps 20 candles, all uniform in size, approximately 8 inches tall, white wax, unscented. Watson examined one carefully, sniffing it, feeling its texture, holding it to the light. These are high-quality beeswax, he observed, not the paraffin candles that have become common. Expensive, traditionally used in religious ceremonies. Someone has invested considerable resources in whatever they're doing. He asked Pemberton to preserve the candles, as Holmes might want to examine them more closely, then thanked both Pemberton and the verger for their assistance. As he prepared to leave the Abbey, Watson found himself pausing in the nave, looking up at the soaring space, imagining it at night, dark except for carefully placed lanterns, empty of the tourists and worshippers who populated it during day hours, filled instead with profound silence and the weight of history. What would it be like to stand here at 2 o'clock in the morning, knowing that someone or something might walk these paths, leaving no trace except footsteps that defied explanation? Watson was not a superstitious man, but he understood how places could work upon imagination, how architecture and history could create psychological states that made the impossible seem briefly plausible. He departed the Abbey and found a cab to return him to Baker Street, his mind full of observations and questions, eager to compare notes with Holmes and hear what his friend had learned at the British Museum. Watson found Holmes already returned when he arrived at 221B, and the sitting room had acquired that particular atmosphere of intense intellectual activity that characterized his friend's periods of deep analysis. Books lay open across multiple surfaces. Papers, covered with notes and diagrams, were arranged in patterns that suggested some organizing principle Watson couldn't immediately discern, and Holmes himself stood before their largest window, staring out at the street below, with that abstracted expression that meant his conscious attention was entirely elsewhere, his eyes seeing not Baker Street, but some internal landscape of theory and deduction. "Ah, Watson," Holmes said, without turning, somehow aware of his friend's arrival, despite giving no sign of attention. "Successful morning?" "Informative," Watson replied, removing his coat and settling into his chair. "I've examined the chapel of St. Faith thoroughly, spoken with the night watchman and verger, documented the space and several pieces of physical evidence. The chapel shows clear signs that someone has been taking measurements of the walls, possibly searching for irregularities in the stone that might indicate sealed cavities." Now Holmes did turn, his interest immediately focused and intense. "Excellent. That confirms my emerging theory. Tell me everything, and spare no detail, however insignificant it might seem." Watson related his morning's observations systematically, the faint chalk marks remaining in the stone, the measurement scratches in the mortar, the high-quality beeswax candles, Pemberton's account of the footsteps' precise path, the mysterious yellowish clay that had appeared on the floor. Holmes listened with complete attention, occasionally asking clarifying questions, his mind clearly processing each fact and observation, fitting them into some larger pattern. When Watson finished, Holmes moved to the table where his research materials were spread, and selected several documents. Your observations align perfectly with what I discovered this morning. Dr. Sebastian Aldridge does indeed work for the British Museum's Department of Manuscripts. Or rather, he did until approximately 3 weeks ago, when he took sudden leave of absence, citing personal matters that required his immediate and exclusive attention. Holmes handed Watson a photograph, evidently obtained from museum records. It showed a man of perhaps 50, with intense eyes and the slight physical neglect, unkempt hair, rumpled clothing, that sometimes characterized individuals whose intellectual obsessions left little energy for practical concerns about appearance. I spoke with his colleagues, Holmes continued, and the picture that emerges is of a brilliant but increasingly eccentric scholar, specializing in medieval mysticism and the intersection of sacred architecture with esoteric tradition. His research at Westminster Abbey was, according to museum records, purely academic, examining historical documents relating to the Abbey's construction. However, colleagues I spoke with suggested that Aldridge had become increasingly interested in what he termed applied medieval science, the actual practice of techniques described in historical texts, rather than merely documenting them as artifacts of belief systems. You think he discovered something specific in those documents, Watson said, beginning to see the pattern. Something that suggested the existence and location of these sealed objects, and his interest shifted from academic study to actual recovery. Precisely, Holmes confirmed, his voice carrying satisfaction at Watson's reasoning. I was able to examine the museum's records of which specific manuscripts Aldridge consulted during his Westminster research. They include several 13th century documents describing the consecration of the current Abbey structure, accounts of items placed within the foundations during construction, and, most significantly, a partially damaged text describing what the author called the Seal of Thresholds, allegedly a stone inscribed with specific prayers and astronomical symbols, supposedly placed at a mathematically significant location within the building to serve as a focal point for the entire structure's spiritual properties. Holmes produced a photographic reproduction of a medieval manuscript page, its Latin text decorated with elaborate illustrations showing a circular stone covered in symbols. Watson leaned forward, examining the image with growing recognition. Holmes, these symbols, they're the same basic patterns that appeared in the Chapel of St. Faith. Not identical, but clearly related, variations on the same geometric and mystical themes. Exactly, Holmes said, with evident excitement. Aldridge studied these texts, identified the symbols associated with this threshold stone, and is now attempting to locate it within Westminster Abbey using methods that combine historical research with medieval mystical practices that he apparently believes have actual efficacy. Watson considered this, turning the implications over in his mind. So, he's conducting rituals in the Chapel of St. Faith because his research suggests the stone might be sealed somewhere in that location. I believe so, Holmes replied. The chapel's Norman construction predates most of the current structure, making it one of the oldest portions of the building. Logical place to seal something during the medieval period. The geometric proportions of the space, which you noted in your observations, would have made it significant according to sacred architectural theory. And the acoustic properties. Holmes paused, his expression showing sudden realization. Watson, those mysterious footsteps, what if they're not supernatural at all, but rather acoustic phenomena deliberately created by the chapel's architecture? He moved to his desk and quickly sketched a diagram of the chapel based on Watson's descriptions. Medieval architects understood acoustics in ways that seem almost supernatural by modern standards. They designed churches to amplify prayers and chants, to create specific resonant effects. If someone placed a device, a mechanical clock mechanism perhaps, somewhere in the structure at the point where these footsteps allegedly begin, it could create sounds that are amplified and channeled by the architecture itself, making them seem to move through the building in specific paths. Watson felt the thrill of understanding dawning. So, Aldridge, or someone working with him, has created these supernatural phenomena as misdirection while conducting systematic searching for the threshold stone. The symbols, the candles, the mysterious footsteps, all theatre designed to keep the Abbey's staff frightened and avoid close examination of what's actually happening in the crypt level. That remains to be confirmed, Holmes cautioned, but it represents my current hypothesis. Tonight, we shall test it directly by observing the Abbey during the hours when these phenomena occur. If we can locate the source of the footstep sounds and catch Aldridge or his associate in the act of conducting their searches, we'll have solved the mystery through entirely natural explanation. The afternoon passed in further preparation, Holmes selecting various tools and equipment he wished to bring to the investigation, consulting additional reference materials about Westminster Abbey's architecture and history, reviewing Watson's detailed sketches of the Chapel of St. Faith. They took a late lunch that Mrs. Hudson prepared, her expression suggesting she knew they were planning nighttime investigations, but wisely choosing not to inquire too deeply into the specifics. As evening approached, the sky darkening earlier now that autumn had truly established itself, both men dressed in dark, practical clothing, suitable for moving quietly through unlit spaces. Holmes packed a small leather case with his investigative equipment, magnifying glass, measuring tape, vials for collecting samples, a small but powerful electric torch, lockpicks in case access required improvisation, and his revolver included not because he anticipated violence, but because prudent preparation for unknown situations was simply sensible. Watson carried his service revolver as well, the familiar weight a comfort during uncertain ventures. They departed Baker Street shortly after 8 o'clock, taking a cab to within a few streets of Westminster Abbey, then walking the final distance through evening air that had turned cold and crisp, their breath visible in the glow of gas lamps. The Abbey loomed against the darkening sky, its Gothic towers and flying buttresses creating dramatic silhouettes, the building seeming to grow larger and more imposing as natural light faded and architectural mass became primarily form and shadow. Canon Whitby had provided Holmes with keys and had arranged for the night watchman to be informed of their presence, though Holmes had requested that no one else be told, maintaining the investigation's discretion. They entered through the same side door Watson had used that morning, and immediately the building's atmosphere transformed. The Abbey during daylight, populated by tourists and staff, maintained some connection to the ordinary world. But at night, empty, lit only by strategic electric bulbs that created islands of visibility surrounded by profound darkness, it became a different space entirely, older, stranger, more itself somehow, as though the absence of human activity allowed the building's essential nature to emerge. Their footsteps echoed with complex reverberation, each sound multiplying and transforming as it bounced off stone surfaces, through corridors and arches and vaults, creating acoustic environments that were genuinely disorienting. Watson found himself understanding how Thomas Pemberton, experienced and skeptical though he was, might interpret ordinary sounds as footsteps moving through distant spaces. Holmes led them first to Poet's Corner, where Pemberton had reported the mysterious footsteps beginning. Using his electric torch, Holmes examined the area with meticulous attention, looking at floors, walls, memorials, searching for anything that might serve as source or amplifier of sound. "Here," he murmured after several minutes, directing his light toward a particular monument. "Watson, look at this ventilation grate. It's part of the building's heating and air circulation system, installed perhaps 20 years ago during modernization. These grates exist throughout the structure, and they're acoustically connected through the ductwork. A sound introduced at one location could travel through these channels and emerge at another, amplified and altered by the passage." Watson knelt beside the grate, examining it as Holmes directed the light. The metalwork was ornate, designed to blend with the Gothic aesthetic, but behind it lay modern ductwork, metal channels running through the ancient stonework. So someone places a mechanical device near one of these grates, Watson reasoned. It creates rhythmic sounds, tapping, clicking, something that resembles footsteps, and those sounds travel through the ducts, emerging at various locations in patterns that seem like someone walking, but are actually acoustic artifacts of the system's layout. "Precisely," Holmes confirmed, clearly pleased with Watson's reasoning. "Let us test this hypothesis. Watson, remain here. I'll go to another location connected by ductwork. We can test whether sounds carry in the manner I'm suggesting." Holmes departed, his footsteps gradually fading, leaving Watson alone in Poet's Corner, surrounded by memorials to the literary dead, shadows thick beyond the small circle of illumination from the electric bulb overhead. The silence grew profound, broken only by the distant, almost subliminal sounds of an old building at rest, the slight settling of stones, the whisper of air moving through spaces, the sounds so quiet they existed at the threshold of hearing. Then, clearly, came a series of knocks. 1, 2, 3, 4, rhythmic and distinct, seeming to come from the floor itself, or perhaps the walls, directionless but definite. Watson jumped slightly, despite anticipating the test, the sounds genuinely startling in the profound quiet. A moment later, Holmes's voice emerged from the ventilation grate, tinny and strange, but comprehensible. "Did you hear that, Watson?" Watson knelt by the grate, speaking toward it. "Yes, perfectly clear." "The sounds seem to come from everywhere and nowhere." "Excellent," came Holmes's response through the duct. "I'm in a corridor approximately 50 yards from your position. The ductwork creates a direct acoustic channel between locations. A mechanical timer placed appropriately could create those mysterious footstep sounds with no one actually present." Holmes returned shortly, and together they began systematically examining other locations along the path Pemberton had described, finding ventilation grates at several points, confirming that sounds could travel the entire route through the building's modern heating system, emerging in patterns that could easily be interpreted as footsteps moving through dark corridors. "So the footsteps are explained," Watson said as they descended toward the crypt level. "What remains is catching Aldridge, or whoever is conducting these searches, and determining if there's any actual substance to this threshold stone business." The crypt felt even more isolated at night, the stone walls seeming to press closer, the electric lights casting harsh shadows that created complex patterns of illumination and darkness. The chapel of St. Faith lay ahead, its entrance dark, and as they approached, Holmes suddenly raised his hand, signalling silence. A light flickered within the chapel, not electric light, but the softer, moving glow of candles, multiple flames creating shifting patterns of illumination. And barely audible, a voice, low, measured, speaking in what sounded like Latin, the words of some recitation or prayer, the tone suggesting ritual rather than conversation. Holmes and Watson approached with extreme care, their movements silent, years of practice allowing them to move without sound despite the darkness. Holmes extinguished his electric torch, and they advanced, using only the faint glow from the chapel ahead to guide their steps. At the chapel entrance, they paused, positioning themselves to observe without being immediately visible, and looked in upon a scene that seemed transported from medieval times. Dozens of candles arranged in a perfect circle, their flames steady in the still air, and within the circle, a figure knelt, dressed in dark robes, hands raised, voice continuing its measured Latin incantation. The figure was Dr. Sebastian Aldrich. Watson recognized him from the photograph Holmes had obtained, though the man's appearance had deteriorated further, his hair wild, his face showing the strain of obsession and sleepless nights. He appeared unaware of observation, completely absorbed in his ritual, reading from a leather-bound book that lay open before him, his voice rising and falling in rhythms that suggested ceremonial formality. Holmes stepped forward into the chapel entrance, his movement drawing Aldrich's attention like a breaking spell. The scholar's head snapped up, his expression cycling rapidly through surprise, fear, and finally something like resignation. "Dr. Aldrich," Holmes said quietly, his voice carrying no judgment or threat, merely statement of fact. "I am Sherlock Holmes, and this is Dr. Watson. We have been engaged to investigate the unusual phenomena occurring here at Westminster Abbey. I believe you and I have a great deal to discuss." For a long moment, Aldrich remained kneeling, frozen in his ritual posture, the candles continuing to burn with steady flames, casting his shadow large and strange against the chapel's stone walls. Then, slowly, he lowered his hands and rose to his feet, the book closing with a soft sound that seemed loud in the heavy silence. "I knew someone would come eventually," Aldrich said, and his voice carried exhaustion far deeper than physical fatigue, the weariness of someone who had pursued something with complete dedication and found only questions rather than answers. "I suppose I'm relieved, actually. This has become..." He gestured vaguely at the candles, the circle, the book. "Something I can no longer control. Perhaps," Holmes suggested gently, "you should begin at the beginning. Tell us what you discovered in the Abbey's archives, what you've been searching for, and why you felt these methods were necessary." Aldrich looked at the two men for a long moment, then seemed to make a decision. He moved to the chapel wall and sat with his back against the stone, suddenly looking less like a mysterious ritualist and more like a profoundly tired scholar who had ventured far beyond his depth. "It started as purely academic research," he began, and now his voice took on the quality of confession, of burden finally shared. "I was examining documents relating to the Abbey's construction, specifically texts describing the consecration ceremonies and the objects placed within the foundations according to medieval custom. Most were routine, saints' relics, copies of psalms, blessed objects meant to sanctify the structure. But I found references, fragmentary and scattered across multiple documents, to something called the Seal of Thresholds, or Threshold Stone. He paused, gathering his thoughts, while Holmes and Watson listened with complete attention, the candles continuing to burn, the chapel maintaining its suspended quality, as though they existed briefly outside normal time. According to the texts, Aldridge continued, this stone was inscribed with specific astronomical and mystical symbols, blessed by multiple religious authorities, and placed at a mathematically calculated location within the Abbey's foundations. It was meant to serve as a focus for the building's spiritual properties, a physical anchor for the structure's sacred geometry. But more than that, his voice dropped lower, taking on a quality of wonder mixed with something like fear. The texts suggested it had been designed as a threshold, literally and metaphorically, between different states of being. The medieval mystics who created it believed certain objects, properly prepared and positioned, could exist partially in multiple realms simultaneously. Watson felt a chill, despite the chapel's air being merely cool rather than cold, for Aldridge's narrative touched on concepts that rational worldview preferred to dismiss as superstition, but which nonetheless carried psychological weight. The accumulated fear and wonder of centuries of human contemplation of mysteries beyond easy explanation. I know how this sounds, Aldridge said, apparently reading Watson's expression in the candlelight. I'm a scholar, trained in historical method, skeptical of supernatural claims. But the more I researched, the more I found consistent patterns across multiple independent sources. Descriptions of this stone, accounts of its properties, records of its placement. These weren't random legends, but documented facts, recorded by serious men who believed absolutely in what they were describing. And you concluded that this threshold stone actually exists, sealed somewhere within Westminster Abbey? Holmes prompted, his tone neutral, neither endorsing nor dismissing Aldridge's beliefs. Yes, Aldridge confirmed. The documents suggested it was placed in this chapel, which predates most of the current structure, sealed beneath the floor or within the walls, at a location calculated using specific geometric principles. I couldn't simply start excavating. That would damage a protected historical building. So he gestured at the ritual circle. I turned to the methods described in the original texts, attempting to use their techniques to locate the stone through mystical means before attempting physical recovery. The symbols, Watson said, understanding. You were recreating medieval rituals, using their own methods to search for something they had hidden. Exactly, Aldridge replied. I followed their instructions precisely. The circle's dimensions, the symbol arrangements, the words of invocation, the timing according to astronomical conditions. I thought if I could recreate their methods exactly, I might achieve the results they described. Knowledge of the stone's location, some kind of resonance or revelation that would guide me. And did you? Holmes asked, genuine curiosity in his voice. Did these rituals produce any results? Aldridge was silent for a long moment, his face working through complex emotions in the shifting candlelight. That's the truly disturbing part, he finally said. Yes, not in any way I can rationally explain or quantify, but yes, when I performed the ritual on specific nights, under conditions the texts deemed significant, I felt something, a pull, an awareness, a sense of direction toward a particular point in this chapel. I know how absurd that sounds. I'm a scientist, a historian. I don't believe in mystical nonsense. Yet, I cannot deny the experience. He rose and moved to a specific point near one of the chapel's supporting pillars, placing his hand against the stone. Here, this location. Every time I performed the ritual properly, I felt drawn to this exact spot. The stone is here, somewhere in this section of the wall or beneath the floor nearby. I'm certain of it. Holmes approached the location Aldridge indicated, examining the wall with his magnifying glass, running sensitive fingers across the stone surface, feeling for irregularities. Watson joined him, and together they studied the area with systematic attention. The wall appeared solid, ancient Norman stonework, showing its 7 centuries of age, but no obvious signs of concealment or alteration. Yet, as Watson examined it, he noticed something, a slight difference in the mortar colour in one section, barely perceptible in the candlelight, but present when one looked closely. "Holmes," he murmured, pointing. "This mortar, it's slightly different from the surrounding areas, possibly repaired or replaced at some point." Holmes produced his small toolkit and carefully began testing the mortar, scraping gently with a thin blade, examining the material's composition and consistency. After several minutes of careful work, he straightened with an expression of intense interest. This section has indeed been repaired, and relatively recently, perhaps 50 to 70 years ago, judging by the mortar's composition and weathering. Someone opened this wall and then resealed it. Dr. Aldridge, your instincts may have been correct, though I suspect the explanation involves historical research and observation rather than mystical revelation. Aldridge approached, hope and vindication warring in his expression. "Can we open it? See what's sealed inside?" Holmes considered carefully. This must be done properly, with Canon Whitby's permission and involvement, documented and executed in a way that respects the historical importance of the structure. But yes, I believe investigation of this section is warranted. Your research, however unorthodox your investigative methods, may have identified something genuinely significant. The tension in the chapel seemed to ease with these words, the air itself feeling lighter, as though some pressure had been relieved. Aldridge moved to extinguish the candles one by one, and as he worked, he spoke with the relief of confession completed. "I apologize for the alarm I caused. The footsteps, the mysterious symbols. I created those deliberately, I admit it, using a mechanical timer and the building's ventilation system for the sounds, and repeatedly drawing the circles to make my presence seem supernatural rather than criminal. I thought if I could frighten the staff, keep them afraid of ghost stories, I could continue my work without close scrutiny. It was wrong, manipulative, and I regret it." "You were in the grip of obsession," Holmes said, without condemnation. "It drives otherwise rational men to irrational acts. The question now is how to proceed ethically and properly." As the last candle was extinguished, leaving only the electric lights, Watson felt the chapel return to its ordinary state. Still old, still impressive, but no longer a stage for mystery and ritual, merely an ancient room in an ancient building. They stood in a small circle, Holmes, Watson, and Aldridge, surrounded by history but firmly in the present, facing questions that required immediate practical decisions. "I suggest," Holmes said, "that we speak with Canon Whitby immediately. We'll explain what we've discovered, request proper authorization to examine this section of wall, and ensure that whatever we find is handled with appropriate care and documentation. Your research deserves recognition, Dr. Aldridge, but the method must be transparent and respectful. Aldridge nodded, looking simultaneously relieved and exhausted. I'll cooperate fully. I just want to know if it's really there, if the threshold stone actually exists, or if I've been chasing medieval fantasy. They left the chapel of St. Faith together, ascending to the Abbey's main level, where Canon Whitby maintained a small office for administrative work. The Canon was still present, having waited, hoping for news, and his expression showed relief when the three men appeared. "Mr. Holmes," he said, rising quickly, "have you solved our mystery?" "We have," Holmes confirmed, "and I believe we may have found something of significant historical importance in the process. May we speak privately?" The next hour passed in detailed explanation, Holmes relating his investigation methodically, Aldridge providing historical context and confessing his role in creating the supernatural phenomena, Watson contributing his observations. Canon Whitby listened with an expression that cycled through surprise, concern, fascination, and finally a kind of scholarly excitement as the implications became clear. "If this threshold stone really exists," Whitby said wonderingly, "it would be an extraordinary discovery, a documented medieval artifact, placed according to specific mystical principles, preserved within the Abbey structure for 7 centuries. The historical and theological significance would be immense. I recommend," Holmes said, "that we arrange for proper archaeological examination of the section Dr. Aldridge has identified. Bring in experts from the British Museum, document everything thoroughly, and if the wall does conceal something, recover it with proper care and attention." Whitby agreed immediately, already making notes about whom to contact, how to proceed. "We'll arrange this for tomorrow," he said. "I'll ensure we have appropriate personnel and equipment. Dr. Aldridge, despite your irregular methods, your research contribution will be acknowledged." Aldridge seemed to relax fully for the first time since they had encountered him in the chapel. "Thank you, Canon. I apologize again for the distress I caused. My obsession led me to poor choices." "Obsession is a kind of madness," Whitby said with unexpected gentleness, "but also a kind of dedication. Perhaps both are necessary for discoveries of significance." They arranged to reconvene the following day for the careful examination of the chapel wall, and then Holmes, Watson, and Aldridge departed the Abbey together, emerging into the London night that had grown cold and clear, stars visible in the gaps between clouds. The city quieter now in the deep evening hours. Aldridge hailed a cab, and before departing, he shook hands with both Holmes and Watson. "Thank you," he said simply, "for understanding, for not treating me as a criminal or madman, for seeing the validity of the question even if you disagreed with my methods." "Knowledge," Holmes replied, "advances through those willing to ask difficult questions, even when the questions lead them into uncomfortable territory. Good night, Dr. Aldridge. Rest well. Tomorrow may bring the answers you've sought." Holmes and Watson walked back to Baker Street, the exercise welcome after hours in the Abbey's confined spaces, the cold air clearing minds engaged with mysteries and history. They walked in companionable silence for several streets before Watson spoke. "Do you think it's really there, Holmes, this threshold stone?" Holmes was quiet for a few steps before responding. "The historical evidence Aldridge uncovered is compelling. Multiple independent sources, serious scholars of their time, specific details about placement and purpose. The section of wall shows signs of being opened and resealed. So yes, I believe something is concealed there. Whether it possesses any special properties beyond historical significance. He smiled slightly. That remains to be seen. Medieval beliefs about sacred objects combining spiritual and physical properties may have been sophisticated metaphor for psychological and cultural significance rather than literal supernatural power. But regardless, we shall know soon. They reached Baker Street to find their sitting room fire burning low but still warm, Mrs. Hudson having prepared the room for their return. Holmes immediately moved to his desk to record the evening's events while they were fresh, while Watson poured them both brandy. The ritual of end-of-day relaxation, a welcome return to normalcy after the chapel's strange atmosphere. "You know," Watson said, settling into his chair, even with rational explanations for the footsteps and Aldridge's methods, there was something about being in that chapel at night, surrounded by candles and ancient stone, listening to him describe medieval mysticism. It worked on the imagination. I found myself half believing in supernatural possibilities. Holmes looked up from his writing with an expression of understanding. Places have power, Watson. Not supernatural power, but psychological and cultural power. Westminster Abbey has witnessed centuries of ritual and belief, death and celebration, the accumulated human emotion and meaning of countless generations. That history creates atmosphere that affects us, whether we acknowledge it or not. We're sophisticated apes, our modern rationalism layered over much older brain structures that respond to setting and ritual and darkness. Feeling that pull toward mystery doesn't make you irrational, it makes you human. Watson smiled, appreciating, as he often did, Holmes's capacity for both rigorous logic and understanding of human nature's complexities. They sat in comfortable silence, the fire settling into embers, the brandy warm, the city outside their windows, gradually stilling as London moved through the small hours toward morning. The following day brought representatives from the British Museum, archaeological specialists, engineers to assess the structural implications of opening the chapel wall, and various officials whose presence Canon Whitby deemed necessary for proper documentation. The Chapel of St. Faith became a hub of scholarly activity, equipment brought down carefully, measurements taken, plans developed for examining the suspicious section of wall with minimal damage to the surrounding structure. Holmes and Watson attended as observers, their investigative role complete, but their curiosity requiring satisfaction. Dr. Aldridge was present as well, recognized now as the historian whose research had led to this moment, his earlier sins forgiven in light of potential discovery. The work proceeded with archaeological patience, skilled workers carefully removing mortar, testing stone, creating an opening that could be expanded or resealed depending on what they found. The chapel filled with quiet professional conversation, the soft sounds of careful work, anticipation building as the concealed space behind the repaired section gradually became accessible. Finally, late in the afternoon, as daylight from the Abbey's high windows was beginning to fade, the opening was large enough to permit visual examination. Canon Whitby, by consensus given the honour, directed an electric torch into the cavity. His gasp brought everyone to alertness. "There's something here," he said, his voice tight with excitement. "A stone, carved, wrapped in what appears to be very old cloth. Under careful supervision, the object was extracted, a circular piece of limestone, perhaps 18 inches in diameter, its surface covered with intricate carvings, wrapped in fabric that had once been fine linen but had deteriorated over centuries into something fragile and discoloured. The cloth was carefully removed, revealing the stone surface fully. The carvings were extraordinary: geometric patterns, astronomical symbols, text in Latin and older languages, arranged with obvious mathematical precision, the whole forming a complex design that was simultaneously artistic and diagrammatic. At the centre was a symbol Watson recognised from Aldrich's rituals, the liminal mark representing thresholds and transition. "The threshold stone," Aldrich whispered, and in his voice was vindication and wonder and something like relief. "It exists. It's real." The assembled scholars examined the artifact with reverent attention, already discussing preservation needs, translation of the inscriptions, historical context, the implications for understanding medieval mystical practices. Photographers documented it from multiple angles. Measurements were taken, preliminary assessments made. Holmes stood somewhat apart from the crowd, observing the stone with that peculiar intensity he brought to significant objects. When he finally spoke, his voice carried thoughtfulness rather than certainty. "Whatever else it represents," he said quietly to Watson, standing beside him, "it demonstrates the medieval mind's sophisticated understanding of symbolism, geometry, and the power of ritual to create meaning. Whether it possesses any properties beyond its historical and artistic significance is perhaps less important than what it reveals about the people who created it, their worldview, their attempt to encode spiritual concepts in physical form, their desire to build literally and metaphorically a threshold between human and divine." Watson nodded, looking at the stone that had driven Aldrich to obsession and drawn them all into this mystery. "And now it will be preserved, studied, possibly displayed, so others can appreciate it. Canon Blackwood's mystery from 1847 is solved. These periodic searches for the stone, occurring when sufficient time passes for new generations to discover the historical references and begin the quest again. The footsteps were acoustic artifacts, the rituals were human theatre, and yet—" Holmes paused, his expression showing the slight uncertainty that occasionally emerged when he encountered questions that resisted simple resolution. "And yet, something genuine was preserved here, hidden by people who believed absolutely in its significance. And that belief, transmitted across centuries, ultimately led to its rediscovery. There's a poetry in that." The day extended into evening as work continued, the stone carefully packaged for transport to the British Museum for preservation and detailed study. Countless photographs and documentation, ensuring that even if something happened to the artifact itself, its discovery would be thoroughly recorded. Canon Whitby arranged for the chapel wall to be professionally restored, the opening to be sealed again with appropriate modern materials, the space to return to its normal function. Holmes and Watson departed as the work was winding down, their role complete, the mystery solved, the supernatural phenomena explained through natural means, and yet something discovered that transcended simple debunking, a genuine historical artifact, a window into medieval worldview, a reminder that even legends sometimes contain kernels of truth. They returned to Baker Street as evening settled into night. The familiar journey, a kind of ritual, returned to normalcy. The case completed satisfactorily, without violence or tragedy. Merely the revelation of human obsession and historical mystery, resolved through reason and investigation. Mrs. Hudson had dinner waiting. She possessed the remarkable ability to sense when they would return and have food ready at precisely the right temperature. And they ate with the comfortable hunger of men who had spent a long day engaged in purposeful activity. Afterward, they resumed their positions in the chairs before the fire, exactly where they had been 2 nights previously, when Canon Whitby had first appeared with his mysterious tale. Another mystery solved, Watson observed, the familiar satisfaction of conclusion settling over him. Though I confess, this one had more ambiguity than most. We explained the phenomena, caught the culprit, such as he was, and yet discovered something genuinely mysterious in the process. The best cases often have that quality, Holmes replied, his long fingers steepled in thought. Clear answers to immediate questions, but deeper mysteries revealed in the process. We solved the haunting, explained the footsteps, identified Dr. Aldridge's methods. But the threshold stone itself, what the medieval mystics intended when they created it, what significance it held for them, whether their beliefs about its properties had any basis in experience or were purely theological metaphor, those questions remain open, requiring historians and theologians rather than consulting detectives. The fire crackled softly, settling deeper, and outside the windows, rain had begun again, that same gentle, persistent whisper that had accompanied Canon Whitby's initial visit, London's eternal conversation with itself, the sound of the city washing itself clean. I wonder, Watson mused, whether Aldridge will continue his research, or whether finding the stone will provide closure. I suspect, Holmes said, that he'll become one of its primary scholars, translating the inscriptions, researching its context, perhaps spending years attempting to understand what the medieval creators intended. Obsession, properly channeled, becomes dedication. His unethical methods were wrong, but his passion for the question was genuine, and now he can pursue answers through proper means. The clock chimed 10, its sound soft in the quiet room, marking time with patient precision. Watson found himself drifting, the combination of long days, the case's resolution, the fire's warmth, and the rain's gentle rhythm, working together to produce that pleasant drowsiness that precedes restful sleep. "Watson," Holmes said quietly, and there was affection in his tone, "you're falling asleep in your chair. Go to bed properly. There's no mystery requiring your vigilance tonight." Watson smiled, rising with the slightly stiff movements of a man no longer young. "Are you coming up?" "Shortly," Holmes replied. "I want to make a few final notes while the day's events are fresh." "Sleep well, old friend." Watson climbed the stairs to his room, the familiar journey through the comfortable home they shared, and prepared for bed with the pleasant tiredness of purposeful days. As he settled beneath the covers, he heard below the soft sounds of Holmes moving about the sitting room, footsteps, the scratch of pen on paper, the settling of the fire, the gentle sounds of 221 B Baker Street at night, the soundtrack of home. Sleep came easily, deep and dreamless, untroubled by mysteries or questions, simply the body's welcome rest after days of activity. And if Watson dreamed at all, it was of ancient stones and candlelit chapels, of footsteps echoing through Gothic spaces, of symbols that bridged centuries, of mysteries that revealed deeper mysteries, of the endless human impulse to seek meaning in the shadows and to preserve what seems significant against time's erosion. But all of it gentle, distant, like a story being told in another room, interesting but no longer urgent, a tale to contemplate in the threshold between waking and sleep, where all things are possible and nothing requires immediate resolution. Morning brought conclusions, administrative details. Canon Whitby sent word that the stone had been successfully transported to the British Museum and was already under examination. Dr. Aldridge formally thanked Holmes and Watson for their discretion and assistance. The Abbey staff were quietly informed that the mysterious phenomena had been explained and resolved. London continued its eternal business, largely unaware that one of its ancient buildings had yielded up a 700-year-old secret. That medieval mystery had briefly touched modern life before being properly catalogued and preserved. Holmes received a letter from the British Museum's director, officially acknowledging his role in the stone's discovery and requesting his assistance if any unusual historical mysteries should arise in future. Watson filed away his notes for possible future chronicling, though he suspected this case, with its ambiguous elements and lack of clear villainy, might remain unpublished, a private memory rather than public account. Days passed into weeks, autumn settling more deeply into the city, leaves falling from the plane trees along Baker Street, the air turning crisp and cold, the year moving inexorably toward winter. The threshold stone case gradually receded into memory, joining the countless other investigations that had filled their years together, some dramatic, some quiet, all forming the texture of their shared life. One evening, perhaps, a month after their nighttime visit to Westminster Abbey, Holmes and Watson found themselves once again in their familiar chairs, fire burning, rain whispering against the windows, the eternal cycle of quiet evenings that formed the foundation beneath their more dramatic adventures. Watson was attempting to read, Holmes was playing violin, soft, contemplative music that suited the evening's mood. Between pieces, Holmes lowered the instrument and looked at Watson with an expression of quiet contentment. "You know, Watson, I've realized something about that threshold stone case. We solved the mystery of the phenomena, explained the supernatural through natural means, and yet, by doing so, we facilitated the discovery of something genuinely extraordinary, an artifact that bridged medieval and modern understanding, that preserved centuries of human thought and belief. We didn't debunk the mystery so much as translate it from supernatural terms into historical ones, and in the process, perhaps the mystery deepened rather than resolved." Watson set aside his book, recognizing that Holmes was in one of his reflective moods, moments when the rational detective philosopher emerged from behind the focused investigator. "You're saying that some mysteries remain mysterious even when explained?" "I'm saying," Holmes replied thoughtfully, "that explanation sometimes reveals new mysteries. We know what the stone is, where it came from, why Aldridge sought it. But we don't know what it meant to the people who created it, what experiences or insights led them to carve those specific symbols and seal it within the Abbey's foundations with such evident care. We don't know what they believed they were accomplishing, or whether their beliefs had any experiential basis. Those questions may never be fully answered, regardless of how thoroughly scholars examine the artifact. So, there are mysteries beyond solving," Watson observed. "There are mysteries that solving transforms into different mysteries," Holmes corrected gently. which is perhaps why I find this profession endlessly engaging. Each answer leads to new questions, each solution reveals new puzzles, and the universe remains endlessly surprising despite our best efforts to catalogue and explain it. Outside, the rain continued its gentle percussion, London's nighttime lullaby, the sound that had accompanied them through countless evenings and would continue long after their particular evenings had ended. The fire burned steadily, casting its warm light into the room's familiar spaces, illuminating the objects that marked their shared life. The chemistry apparatus, the violin, the shelves of books, the pipe rack, the bullet holes in the wall that Holmes had never bothered to repair, the comfortable clutter of a space lived in and loved. "I think," Watson said quietly, "that mystery is perhaps necessary, that complete knowledge would be less satisfying than we imagine, that the questions are as important as the answers." The clock struck 11, marking another hour's passage, time flowing forward with its inevitable patience. Watson felt sleep approaching, that gentle drowsiness that came easily after contemplative evenings, the body recognizing comfort and safety, permitting itself to relax into rest. "I'm for bed," he announced, rising from his chair. These philosophical reflections are pleasant, but best contemplated from the threshold of sleep, where they can drift into dreams. "Sleep well," Holmes said, returning his violin to his shoulder, preparing to play again. "I'll stay up a bit longer. This particular piece requires practice, and I prefer to attempt it when I won't disturb the household." Watson climbed the stairs once more, the familiar journey, hearing behind him the soft, tentative notes of Holmes's violin as he worked through the piece, the sounds following Watson up into his room, a gentle accompaniment to the evening's end. He prepared for bed with the comfortable routine of years, his mind drifting across the past weeks, the mystery, the investigation, the discovery, the resolution, the philosophical reflections, all of it part of the rich texture of life at Baker Street, the endless variation within comforting patterns, the balance between excitement and peace that characterized their shared existence. As he settled into bed, the violin playing drifted up from below, soft and distant, combining with the rain sounds to create a gentle symphony of home. Watson's eyes grew heavy, consciousness beginning its nightly journey into sleep, thoughts fragmenting and drifting, becoming dreamlike and strange. He thought of the threshold stone, sealed in darkness for 7 centuries, waiting with patient silence for someone to seek it with sufficient determination. He thought of the medieval mystics who had carved those intricate symbols, believing absolutely in their significance, performing rituals with the same seriousness that modern scientists brought to laboratory experiments. He thought of the footsteps echoing through Westminster Abbey's darkened spaces, acoustic phenomena transformed by imagination and architecture into ghostly presence. He thought of Dr. Aldridge kneeling in candlelight, pursuing answers through methods that combined scholarship and ritual, reason and obsession. And as sleep finally claimed him, Watson's last conscious thought was that mysteries were perhaps humanity's natural state, that we moved through existence surrounded by questions, occasionally finding answers, but more often transforming questions into new questions, and that this endless inquiry was not frustrating, but rather profoundly human, the characteristic that elevated us above mere survival into something resembling wisdom. Sleep came, deep and dreamless, or, if dreams visited, they left no memory upon waking, merely the sense of having travelled somewhere, of having contemplated things that consciousness couldn't quite retain, but which left some subtle residue, some alteration in perspective that couldn't be articulated, but was nonetheless real. Below, in the sitting room, Holmes continued playing his violin for some time, working through the difficult piece, finding satisfaction in the challenge, the methodical practice, the incremental improvement. Eventually, he too retired, climbing the stairs quietly, the house settling into nighttime silence, the fire burning down to embers, the rain continuing its gentle whisper against the windows. And Westminster Abbey stood in darkness, ancient and patient, holding its remaining secrets with the silence of centuries, its stones remembering footsteps and prayers, coronations and burials, the endless human drama that had played out within its walls. The threshold stone's cavity had been resealed, the wall restored, the chapel returned to its normal function, but the memory remained, of mystery revealed, of past touching present, of questions that transcended easy answers. In museums and archives, scholars would spend years studying the stone, translating its inscriptions, debating its significance, attempting to understand the minds that had created it. Some would approach it as pure historical artifact, interesting, but entirely explicable within medieval religious context. Others would sense something more, something that resisted complete explanation, a residue of belief and intention that couldn't be fully captured by academic analysis. And periodically, someone would stand before it in the museum's quiet gallery, looking at those intricate symbols carved by long-dead hands, and feel the question rising. What did they know? What were they trying to preserve? What experiences or insights led them to carve these specific patterns with such obvious care? And in that moment of wondering, the threshold would activate, not supernaturally, but profoundly nonetheless, connecting past and present, allowing communion across centuries, demonstrating that mystery, properly understood, was not ignorance awaiting dispelling, but rather the acknowledgement of depths that exceeded easy comprehension. Time moved forward, as it always does, measured by countless clocks across London, marked by the sun's passage across sky, by seasons changing, by human hearts beating their finite allotment before silence. Days followed days, the eternal cycle, the rhythm that underlay all human activity and meaning. At Baker Street, Holmes and Watson continued their work. Cases arrived, mysteries were investigated, questions were answered, and between the dramatic moments, there were countless quiet evenings before the fire, conversations about philosophy and science and human nature, the comfortable companionship of two men who knew each other with a depth that only years and shared experience could provide. And sometimes, on evenings when rain whispered against the windows and the fire burned low, they would speak of the threshold stone case, remembering the mysterious footsteps, the candles in darkness, the moment of discovery when ancient object emerged from its 7th-century concealment. They would contemplate the questions it raised, the answers it provided, the new mysteries it revealed, and find in that contemplation a kind of peace, the recognition that some puzzles were meant not to be completely solved, but rather to be carried forward, contemplated, allowed to exist as questions that enriched rather than troubled the mind. Mystery, properly understood, was not enemy of reason, but companion to wisdom. The acknowledgement that knowledge had depths and dimensions that exceeded temporary comprehension, that the universe was generous with questions, even when parsimonious with answers, and that this imbalance was not design flaw, but rather invitation to humility, to wonder, to the ongoing inquiry that characterized human consciousness at its best. The rain continued its gentle symphony, London's eternal lullaby, washing the city clean, preparing it for tomorrow's continuation of the eternal human project. Seeking, questioning, occasionally discovering, always wondering, moving through existence with the strange combination of ignorance and insight that defined the human condition. And in quiet rooms across the city, people drifted towards sleep, consciousness fragmenting into dream, the day's concerns receding, the mind entering those liminal spaces between waking and sleeping, where boundaries blurred and everything seemed simultaneously real and insubstantial, significant and ephemeral. In those threshold spaces, mysteries became not problems to solve, but landscapes to inhabit. Questions transformed from irritation into comfort, and sleep arrived not as unconsciousness, but as different consciousness, travelling through internal territories as vast and mysterious as any external landscape, the mind exploring itself in darkness, processing the day's experiences, creating meanings and narratives, dreaming the dreams that helped make sense of existence, or, at least, made existence bearable. Time flowed like water, like music, like breath, in and out, forward and back, the eternal rhythm, the pulse beneath all things, the heartbeat of existence itself, steady and patient, requiring nothing, offering everything, simply present, simply continuing, simply being what time was and had always been and would always be, until the final cessation, whenever that might come. But that final cessation was distant, unimaginable, irrelevant to present moment, and present moment was all there truly was. This breath, this heartbeat, this soft sound of rain, this weight of blankets, this journey into sleep, this letting go of consciousness, this trust in tomorrow's arrival, this acceptance of mystery as fundamental condition, rather than temporary ignorance. Sleep deepened, dreams arrived or didn't arrive. The night continued its patient passage toward dawn, and across London, countless sleepers travelled their internal landscapes, while the city around them rested, buildings standing patient in darkness, the Thames flowing with its tidal rhythms, the stars wheeling overhead behind clouds, the vast machinery of existence continuing its eternal operation, indifferent but not hostile, simply proceeding according to principles too deep for complete comprehension. And somewhere in consciousness or unconsciousness, in dream or memory or imagination, there was Westminster Abbey with its ancient stones and accumulated history, its chapels and monuments and hidden spaces, its thousands of burials and countless prayers, its weight of meaning pressing down through centuries into present moment, its mysteries revealed and unrevealed, its threshold stone that had bridged medieval and modern understanding, its eternal invitation to contemplation and wonder. And there was Dr. John Watson, faithful companion, chronicler of adventures, bridge between genius and humanity, reliable presence through countless investigations and quiet evenings, the stability that allowed Holmes's brilliance to flourish. And there was Mrs. Hudson, maintaining the household with her combination of practicality and affection, providing the foundation of home that allowed everything else to unfold. And there was London, vast and various, containing multitudes, the empire's heart, the stage where countless dramas played out daily, the city that never truly slept, but merely quieted, resting between exertions, gathering strength for tomorrow's continuation. And there was the rain, washing everything, cleansing and renewing, the water cycling from river to sky, to earth to river again, the eternal circulation, the planetary respiratory system, the breath of the world itself. And there was sleep, consciousness dissolving into dreams or darkness, the daily death and resurrection, the trust in morning's arrival, the letting go that required faith in continuation, the acceptance that awareness was not continuous but rather rhythmic, appearing and disappearing like breath, like waves, like the pulse of life itself. And finally, there was peace, not the absence of question or challenge, but rather the acceptance of existence on its own terms, mystery and all, question and uncertainty, and occasional answer and frequent wonder, the whole magnificent and frustrating and beautiful experience of being alive, aware, connected to centuries of human inquiry, and to the eternal present moment simultaneously. The rain whispered its gentle lullaby, consciousness fragmented into sleep, and mysteries remained mysteries, which was exactly as it should be, exactly as it needed to be, exactly as it would always be. The questions enduring even when answers arrived, the threshold between known and unknown forever present, forever inviting crossing, forever promising that on the other side of understanding lay more understanding, deeper mystery, richer questions, the infinite regression of inquiry that characterized consciousness, attempting to comprehend itself and the universe it inhabited. Sleep, deep and dreamless, or filled with dreams that would not be remembered, consciousness traveling territories that had no map, the mind doing whatever mysterious work minds do in darkness, and tomorrow would arrive with its own concerns and questions. But tomorrow was not yet present, and present moment was sleep, was rest, was letting go, was trust, was peace. Good night, dear listener. Thank you for accompanying me on this journey through Westminster Abbey's mysteries, through Victorian London's gaslit streets, through the comfortable rooms at Baker Street, where friendship and investigation intertwined. I hope this story has helped slow your thoughts, eased your journey toward rest, provided gentle companionship as you drift into sleep. If you enjoyed this journey into Gothic mystery and Victorian atmosphere, I invite you to subscribe to this channel, to like this story, to explore other narrative journeys designed specifically for peaceful sleep. Your support allows these stories to continue, allows these quiet narrative spaces to exist as alternatives to the busy, demanding world. But most importantly, sleep well. Let the mysteries we've contemplated together become gentle companions to your dreams. Let the rain continue its whisper as you drift deeper into rest. Let the questions remain questions, requiring nothing of you, simply existing as interesting landscapes for the dreaming mind to explore without urgency or anxiety. Sleep and know that mysteries will still be there tomorrow, patient as ancient stones, waiting with Westminster Abbey's eternal patience for those willing to seek them. But tonight, seeking can wait. Tonight is for rest, for restoration, for the daily miracle of consciousness, releasing its grip and trusting in tomorrow's arrival. Thank you for listening. Good night. Sleep well, dream peacefully, and may you wake tomorrow refreshed, renewed, ready to engage with your own mysteries and questions, with the same combination of curiosity and acceptance that guided Holmes and Watson through their investigation. The rain continues, the city sleeps, and you too can sleep now. The story complete, the journey ended, the the threshold crossed into rest. Good night.